If that rescue vehicle rolls another 20 feet, someone is going to lose control of it. Ethan Brooks's calm voice sliced through the tense silence of the control room just as the countdown clock on the wall flashed 10 seconds until launch. Every conversation stopped. Dozens of engineers, investors, and executives turned toward the young black engineer standing beside a digital blueprint that no one had looked at in the past 48 hours. The massive testing hangar outside the glass walls buzzed with anticipation as television crews adjusted their cameras around the gleaming emergency response prototype parked beneath bright industrial lights. The vehicle represented nearly 4 years of development and more than $80 million in private investment. It was supposed to redefine disaster response across America. Instead, Ethan's warning hung over the room like an approaching storm. Richard Coleman, the white-haired executive director of the Michigan Mobility Research Center, slowly lowered the tablet in his hands and stared at Ethan with visible irritation. "We already reviewed your concerns," Richard said, his voice measured but cold. "The review ignored the structural fatigue calculations," Ethan replied without raising his voice. "The front suspension arm isn't failing under normal driving. It'll fail during an emergency evasive maneuver with a full medical payload." A quiet laugh escaped from somewhere near the conference table. Another executive leaned back in his chair. "He's still talking about that spreadsheet," someone whispered. "That's because the spreadsheet describes physics," Ethan answered, hearing every word. Richard crossed his arms. "You're 21 years old, Ethan. Half the people in this room have been designing vehicles longer than you've been alive." Ethan met his eyes without blinking. "Steel doesn't care how old we are." The room fell silent again. Sarah Whitmore, one of the lead investors from Chicago, exchanged an uncomfortable glance with James Walker, whose investment firm had financed the final production phase. James sighed impatiently. "Richard, we're live in less than a minute." Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Exactly." He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "You were invited here to observe after your internship ended. Nothing more." Ethan reached into the worn leather folder tucked beneath his arm and carefully removed several engineering drawings covered with handwritten notes. The edges were bent from being carried for weeks. "Please," he said quietly, "just compare revision 7 with the current production model. Someone changed the reinforcement geometry after my stress simulations." Richard never looked at the papers. "We're done discussing this." Ethan placed the drawings on the conference table anyway. "The load transfers into a single joint during sudden steering corrections. That's where it'll crack." James Walker rubbed his forehead. "We've already certified the prototype. Certification doesn't change the math," Ethan answered. A younger engineer sitting near the back glanced nervously at Ethan's calculations before quickly looking away as if afraid someone might notice. Richard's patience disappeared. "Security," the word echoed sharply through the room. 2 uniformed security officers immediately stepped inside the glass conference room from the hallway. Neither looked comfortable. They recognized Ethan. Everyone in the building did. He had spent months working longer hours than anyone else, often sleeping beside prototype components while running overnight simulations. "Mr. Brooks," one officer said gently, "we need you to come with us." Ethan didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Richard. "If you launch that vehicle today, you'll prove I'm right in front of every investor standing here." Richard's jaw tightened. "Or we'll prove you were never qualified to be part of this project." Ethan slowly closed his folder. His expression never changed. There was no anger, no desperation, only disappointment. As the officers escorted him toward the exit, dozens of engineers watched in complete silence. Some avoided looking at him altogether. Others stared at the engineering drawings still lying untouched across the polished conference table. Ethan stopped briefly beside the door and looked back one final time. "When the suspension fails," he said calmly, "don't waste time asking who predicted it. Ask why nobody listened." The heavy door closed behind him with a quiet click. Outside, Ethan walked through the long steel corridor toward the employee parking lot, while the countdown speakers echoed faintly across the research campus. 9, 8, 7. Behind the glass walls, Richard Coleman faced the enormous observation window overlooking the test track. The prototype rescue vehicle began rolling forward beneath brilliant morning sunlight as applause spread across the executive gallery. No one noticed the engineering drawings still resting on the conference table. No one except Sarah Whitmore, whose eyes drifted back toward Ethan's abandoned calculations just as the vehicle accelerated toward the first emergency maneuver. 72 hours earlier, Long before executives filled the observation deck with polished shoes and confident smiles, the engineering floor at the Michigan Mobility Research Center looked very different. The building was almost silent except for the steady hum of three-dimensional printers, cooling fans, and distant welding equipment. Ethan Brooks preferred arriving before sunrise because the empty laboratory allowed him to think without interruptions. At 5:30 every morning, he unlocked the side entrance with his temporary badge, placed a faded travel mug beside his workstation, and opened the simulation software before most of the city of Detroit had finished its first cup of coffee. The rescue vehicle existed as thousands of numbers before it ever became steel and aluminum, and Ethan trusted numbers more than opinions. He carefully adjusted another virtual stress simulation before the computer rendered the results across 3 large monitors. Red warning zones spread across the front suspension assembly exactly where they had appeared the previous afternoon. Ethan leaned back slowly and whispered to himself, "Same failure point." He exported another report, attached supporting calculations, and emailed the document directly to Richard Coleman, along with every member of the senior engineering team. The subject line was simple: Critical Structural Load Review Number 4. 23 minutes later, a reply appeared. It contained only one sentence: "Thank you for your input. The current design remains unchanged." Ethan sighed quietly but refused to give up. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You are here before the lights again." Ethan looked over his shoulder and smiled. Maria Alvarez, a 62-year-old maintenance supervisor who had worked in the facility longer than almost anyone else, pushed her cleaning cart past his station. "Good morning, Miss Maria," Ethan said warmly. "Trying to beat the computers again?" she asked with a laugh. "Trying to stop them from embarrassing us," Ethan replied. Maria glanced at the glowing diagrams covering his screens. "You always look worried when those red lines show up." Ethan nodded. "Because machines do not care about optimism." She rested both hands on the handle of her cart. "Then why do they keep ignoring you?" Ethan smiled politely instead of answering. He had learned that explaining office politics rarely solved anything. Instead, he opened another simulation using heavier emergency equipment inside the vehicle. The digital prototype entered a sharp avoidance maneuver at 58 miles per hour. Less than 2 seconds later, the suspension assembly fractured exactly where Ethan expected. The virtual rescue vehicle spun sideways across the simulation before the screen froze. Ethan quietly closed his eyes. Again, he whispered. At 8 o'clock, engineers began filling the laboratory. Conversations about stock prices, weekend golf trips, and upcoming investor meetings replaced the peaceful silence of dawn. Ethan carried a stack of printed reports toward Conference Room 3, where the weekly engineering review was already beginning. Richard Coleman stood beside an enormous display screen discussing production deadlines. "We cannot afford another delay," Richard announced. "The investors expect demonstration readiness this week." Ethan waited until Richard finished speaking before raising his hand. "I have updated load distribution data that shows a structural concern during emergency steering." Richard barely glanced at him. "Leave it with the design team." "I already did," Ethan replied. 3 times. A few engineers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard folded his arms. "Then, I am sure they evaluated it." Ethan placed the reports on the conference table. With respect, nobody addressed the actual calculations. Richard looked directly at him for several long seconds before speaking. "Experience teaches engineers when to stop chasing theoretical problem," Ethan answered calmly. "Real accidents do not know the difference between theory and reality." The room became unusually quiet. One senior engineer reached for Ethan's report, but Richard gently placed his own notebook on top of it before anyone could read the first page. "Meeting adjourned," Richard announced. Chairs slid backward across the polished floor as everyone gathered their laptops. Ethan slowly collected the reports that no one had opened. As he walked toward the hallway, another young engineer named Tyler Reynolds hurried after him. Tyler lowered his voice before speaking. "I actually read your first report." Ethan stopped walking. "Did you?" Tyler nodded cautiously. "Your numbers looked solid. Then why did nobody say anything?" Tyler looked toward the conference room to make sure nobody was listening. "Because nobody wants to challenge Richard before the investor demonstration." Ethan studied Tyler's uneasy expression. "Engineering is supposed to protect people, not protect reputations." Tyler looked down at the floor. "I know." Ethan offered a small, reassuring smile before placing the reports back inside his worn leather folder. "One day," he said quietly, "someone will finally look past the name on the badge and start reading what is actually on the page." Tyler watched him walk back toward his workstation, where another simulation was already waiting to finish. its warning indicator glowing bright red against the dark monitor, as if the machine itself refused to stay silent. 2 years earlier, on a cold November evening, Ethan Brooks was driving home along Interstate 94 after delivering a custom hydraulic prototype to a community vocational school outside Ann Arbor. His old silver pickup truck rattled gently over the pavement, the passenger seat crowded with toolboxes, engineering notebooks, and half-finished sketches rolled inside a cardboard tube. The sunset had already disappeared behind thick gray clouds, leaving the highway washed in the pale glow of headlights stretching for miles. Ethan always drove the speed limit. He believed careful decisions mattered long before emergencies appeared. His phone rested face down beside the gear shift, silent except for navigation directions guiding him toward Detroit. Suddenly, a line of brake lights flared ahead. Traffic slowed almost instantly. Ethan eased onto the brake pedal and scanned the road instead of staring only at the vehicle directly ahead. Nearly 200 yards farther down the highway, an expensive black sport utility vehicle had come to rest against the concrete median after what appeared to be a chain reaction accident. Drivers stepped cautiously onto the shoulder while several people called emergency services. Ethan parked safely, grabbed a compact equipment case from behind his seat, and hurried toward the damaged vehicle without hesitation. A state trooper had not yet arrived, and paramedics were still several minutes away. As Ethan approached, he noticed something unusual. The passenger cabin remained intact, but the electronic door system had completely shut down after the impact. Inside, a frightened teenage boy sat strapped securely in his seat, unable to open the electronically controlled doors. His breathing was quick, and his hands trembled as he looked through the side window. A woman standing nearby called anxiously, "Can anybody get this door open?" Another driver pulled repeatedly on the handle without success. Ethan knelt beside the front wheel and examined the damaged electrical housing beneath the frame. "The emergency battery isolated itself," he said quietly. "The manual override is not responding." The boy looked toward him through the glass. "Can you help me?" Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes. I just need you to stay calm." He opened his equipment case and removed a small handheld diagnostic module connected to several insulated cables. It was not a commercial product. Ethan had designed it himself while experimenting with emergency access systems for future rescue vehicles. A middle-aged man wearing a business suit frowned as he watched. "Are you authorized to use that?" Ethan looked up briefly. "I built it." The man blinked in surprise but stepped aside. Ethan carefully connected the module beneath the damaged control panel. Tiny indicator lights flickered across the device as lines of code scrolled across its narrow display. He listened closely to the faint clicking sounds inside the vehicle before making another adjustment. "Come on," he whispered. The diagnostic unit emitted a soft tone. A second later, the electronic locks disengaged with a clear mechanical click. Ethan gently opened the passenger door. Fresh air rushed inside. The teenage boy exhaled deeply and smiled with visible relief. "You did it," he said. Ethan helped him step carefully onto the shoulder before checking to make sure he appeared steady. Moments later, the distant sound of approaching emergency vehicles echoed across the highway. The boy's father hurried over after speaking with police officers farther down the road. "Ryan," he called, embracing his son with obvious gratitude. "Are you all right?" Ryan nodded. "He got me out." The father turned toward Ethan, but at that exact moment, another group of first responders surrounded the family to begin routine evaluations. Ethan quietly packed away his diagnostic device without saying a word. One paramedic noticed him. "Sir, were you involved?" Ethan smiled politely. "No, everything is under control now." Before anyone could ask another question, Ethan returned to his pickup truck and drove away into the evening traffic. He never learned the family's name. He did not wait for recognition. Back in his small garage workshop later that night, Ethan carefully placed the diagnostic device onto a workbench beside dozens of hand-built prototypes labeled with neat black marker. Above the bench hung a simple handwritten note that his late grandfather had given him years before. It read, "Real engineers solve problems before they ask who gets the credit." Ethan looked at the words for a long moment before opening another notebook filled with rescue vehicle sketches. Using the same quiet determination that had guided him on the highway only hours earlier, he began redesigning an emergency suspension system capable of protecting lives under the most demanding conditions, never imagining that one day the people who benefited from his work would sit across a polished conference table and dismiss the very mind that had already protected someone they loved. The afternoon before the public demonstration, The executive board gathered inside the glass conference suite overlooking the final assembly floor. Sunlight reflected across polished steel beams and rows of unfinished rescue vehicles waiting for inspection. Every chair around the walnut conference table was occupied by investors, department heads, legal advisors, and senior engineers. Richard Coleman stood confidently beside a giant presentation screen displaying projected manufacturing costs, national distribution plans, and expected government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Excitement filled the room. Success already felt inevitable to almost everyone present. Ethan Brooks quietly entered carrying the same worn leather folder that had traveled everywhere with him during the past 6 months. His shirt sleeves were neatly rolled above his wrists, and a stack of revised engineering drawings rested carefully beneath his arm. He paused near the doorway until Richard noticed him. "You have exactly 3 minutes," Richard said without inviting him to sit. Ethan nodded respectfully. "That is all I need." He connected his laptop to the presentation screen, replacing colorful financial charts with a rotating 3-dimensional model of the rescue vehicle. Bright red stress indicators immediately appeared around the front suspension assembly. Several executives exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan pointed toward the animation. This revision was approved 11 days ago after reinforcing the roof structure to support additional emergency equipment. The added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 4.3 inches. James Walker frowned. That was already reviewed. Ethan calmly zoomed into the digital model. Only the weight distribution was reviewed. Nobody recalculated the dynamic load during emergency steering. Richard folded his arms. "Our senior engineers signed off on those calculations." Ethan nodded once. They signed off using the previous suspension geometry. Sarah Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "Can you explain that?" Ethan switched to another diagram, showing 2 nearly identical suspension arms. Revision 7 included a secondary reinforcement bracket here. He touched the screen with a laser pointer. Revision 8 removed it to reduce manufacturing costs. James immediately looked toward Richard. Richard answered before anyone else could speak. The design team determined the bracket was unnecessary. Ethan remained composed. "The bracket costs $138 per vehicle." He paused for a moment before adding, "Replacing a failed rescue vehicle costs considerably more." A quiet murmur spread around the table. Richard's expression hardened. "You are making assumptions." Ethan shook his head. "No, sir. I am reading the simulation results." He opened another report containing hundreds of data points collected over several weeks. "I ran 72 independent stress simulations under different weather conditions, payload weights, and emergency response scenarios. Every single simulation reached the same conclusion." He pressed another key. A digital animation showed the suspension absorbing repeated impacts before a highlighted joint exceeded its design tolerance. The screen froze. Silence filled the room. Finally, one board member spoke. "How confident are you?" Ethan answered without hesitation. 99.8%. Richard let out a short breath through his nose. "Engineering is never 100%. Ethan looked directly at him. "Neither are funerals." The sentence settled heavily over the conference room. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Sarah slowly turned another page of Ethan's printed report. "Richard, did your review committee receive all of this?" Richard answered carefully. "We received numerous reports from several interns during development." Ethan quietly corrected him. "I am not discussing intern reports. I am discussing verified engineering data." Richard walked toward the display and disconnected Ethan's laptop from the presentation system. The engineering diagrams disappeared, replaced once again by colorful financial projections. "We appreciate your enthusiasm," Richard announced to the room. "However, production decisions require practical experience, not theoretical perfection." Ethan gently picked up his laptop. "Physics is practical." Richard ignored the remark. "The demonstration proceeds tomorrow exactly as planned." James Walker glanced back and forth between both men. "Should we at least postpone until another independent review is completed?" Richard answered immediately. "A delay would damage investor confidence." Ethan responded quietly. "Ignoring evidence damages something far more important." Richard stepped closer. "You have already made your recommendation." Ethan nodded. "Because I believe this vehicle is supposed to save lives." Richard looked around the room before speaking firmly enough for everyone to hear. "Beginning tomorrow morning, Mr. Brooks will no longer participate in this project in any capacity." The words landed with unexpected finality. Several engineers lowered their eyes. Tyler Reynolds looked visibly shocked but remained silent. Maria Alvarez, cleaning the hallway outside through the transparent glass wall, paused her cart after seeing Ethan gather his papers. Ethan placed every unused report back into his leather folder with slow, careful movements. He looked once around the room filled with expensive suits, polished shoes, and confident faces before quietly saying, "One day this project will ask the same questions I asked today. I only hope the answers do not arrive too late." Without another word, he walked toward the conference room door. Behind him, Richard resumed discussing production schedules, while the untouched engineering reports disappeared beneath stacks of financial presentations, unnoticed by nearly everyone except Sarah Whitmore, whose eyes lingered on the closed leather folder until Ethan disappeared down the long corridor. The morning air over Detroit carried the crisp chill of early autumn as reporters gathered behind safety barriers surrounding the outdoor demonstration track. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while drones hovered quietly above the research campus, capturing live footage for investors watching across the country. Inside the observation gallery, Richard Coleman stood beside James Walker and Sarah Whitmore, greeting guests with the relaxed confidence of a man convinced success was only minutes away. Through the towering glass windows, the rescue vehicle rested beneath bright sunlight, its polished body reflecting the blue Michigan sky. Engineers completed final inspections while technicians monitored dozens of sensors displayed across a massive control screen. Richard glanced at his watch. "Begin the sequence," he instructed. The test director nodded. "Prototype Alpha is entering Phase 1. A clear electronic tone echoed through the control room. The rescue vehicle accelerated smoothly onto the track, its electric motors producing little more than a steady mechanical hum. Applause spread across the executive gallery as the vehicle completed its first straightaway without difficulty. James smiled confidently. Beautiful stability. Richard folded his hands behind his back, exactly as expected. The display monitors showed every system operating within acceptable limits. Steering response remained precise. Battery temperatures were normal. Suspension travel appeared balanced. One engineer quietly remarked, "Everything looks perfect." Sarah remained unusually quiet. Her attention drifted toward the engineering reports still sitting inside her leather briefcase. She remembered Ethan's final words with uncomfortable clarity. Physics is practical. Outside, the vehicle approached the emergency response section of the course, where hydraulic barriers simulated unexpected obstacles that rescue teams often encountered during real disasters. The test director announced each maneuver over the room speakers. Emergency lane change in 5 seconds. The vehicle accelerated to 58 miles per hour, steering input beginning. The prototype smoothly shifted left before immediately returning toward the center lane. For a brief moment, everything appeared flawless. Then one tiny yellow indicator flashed across the engineering display. A young technician frowned. Minor suspension load spike. Richard barely looked toward the screen. Continue. The vehicle entered the second emergency maneuver carrying the equivalent weight of fully loaded medical equipment. Hydraulic actuators shifted instantly. Another indicator appeared. This one remained yellow slightly longer. Tyler Reynolds leaned closer to his monitor. "Front left load is climbing faster than expected," Richard answered without concern. "It is still inside operating range." Tyler hesitated. "Barely." Sarah slowly stood from her chair. "Can we pause the demonstration?" Richard looked genuinely surprised. "For what?" Before anyone answered, another alarm sounded. Soft at first, then louder. Several graphs on the engineering display changed from green to orange. "Load distribution becoming uneven," another technician reported. James Walker looked toward Richard. "What does that mean?" Richard answered quickly. "Sensor calibration, nothing more." Outside, the prototype approached the final obstacle designed to simulate an emergency avoidance maneuver around stalled traffic. The steering wheel turned sharply. The vehicle leaned heavily into the corner. Suddenly, the live telemetry froze for less than a second before rapidly updating again. Tyler's face lost its color. "Suspension stress exceeds predicted tolerance." Richard's confidence disappeared for the first time that morning. "Verify the sensors." Tyler typed rapidly across his keyboard. His breathing became noticeably faster. "Already verified." Another engineer compared multiple screens. The readings match. The room grew silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards. On the track, the rescue vehicle slowed automatically as onboard safety software detected abnormal structural movement. A warning message appeared across every monitor. Mechanical load protection activated. The demonstration vehicle safely rolled to a controlled stop before completing the course. Emergency protocols immediately prevented further movement. No collision occurred. No one was harmed. Yet the silence inside the observation gallery felt heavier than any crash could have created. Richard stared at the frozen telemetry data. Every highlighted stress point matched the exact locations Ethan had circled repeatedly in his engineering reports. Tyler quietly opened Ethan's archived simulation files beside the live test results. He compared them line by line. Then he looked up slowly. They are identical. Nobody answered him. Sarah stepped toward the enormous display where two images now filled the screen side by side. On the left appeared Ethan's simulation created 3 days earlier. On the right appeared the real test data collected only seconds ago. Every load curve overlapped almost perfectly. Every warning threshold matched. Every structural prediction had become reality. James Walker removed his glasses and stared at the screen in disbelief. He knew. Sarah corrected him softly. No. She looked directly at Richard Coleman. He tried to tell us. Richard's shoulders seemed suddenly heavier than before. He remembered Ethan placing those engineering drawings onto the conference table. He remembered refusing to read them. He remembered saying experience mattered more than calculations. Now, every monitor surrounding him quietly proved otherwise. No one applauded. No one spoke about investors or production schedules anymore. The only sound inside the control room came from the steady electronic tone of the suspended test sequence, while outside beneath the bright Michigan sun, the rescue vehicle remained perfectly still at the center of the track, waiting for the engineer who had already explained exactly why it would stop there. The research campus slowly emptied as television trucks pulled away one by one, their satellite dishes folding toward the gray afternoon sky. Employees, who usually filled the parking lots with conversation, walked silently toward their cars, speaking in hushed voices that carried more uncertainty than confidence. Inside the engineering building, the large display screens had gone dark, leaving only the faint reflection of empty workstations beneath rows of fluorescent lights. Richard Coleman remained alone in the observation gallery for several minutes after everyone else had left. The frozen telemetry graph still occupied the largest monitor in the room, every warning point perfectly aligned with the calculations he had refused to read. He reached toward the keyboard, opened Ethan Brooks's archived engineering reports, and slowly scrolled through page after page of handwritten notes, detailed simulations, and carefully documented recommendations. There was no emotion in the reports, no accusations, no frustration, only evidence. Richard quietly lowered himself into a chair and whispered to the empty room, "How did I miss all of this?" No one answered. Several miles away, Ethan guided his aging pickup truck through the familiar streets of Detroit, passing brick warehouses, neighborhood diners, and small family-owned repair shops that had shaped his childhood. Rain clouds gathered overhead, turning the late afternoon sunlight into a soft silver glow that reflected across the windshield. He drove without music, without phone calls, and without looking back toward the research center. Every stoplight gave him another moment to think, but his thoughts never lingered on losing the project. Instead, they returned to the rescue vehicle itself. Somewhere inside that unfinished machine, a better solution was still waiting to be built. Ethan eventually turned onto a quiet residential street, lined with maple trees whose leaves had already begun changing color. At the end of the block stood a modest, one-story brick home with a detached garage that had served as his personal workshop since high school. The garage door rolled upward with a familiar mechanical hum. Inside, shelves filled with carefully labeled components stretched from one wall to the other. Hydraulic cylinders, aluminum brackets, electric motors, sensors, notebooks, and half-built prototypes rested exactly where Ethan had left them. Every tool had its place. Every drawing had a purpose. He placed his worn leather folder onto the wooden workbench beside the handwritten note from his grandfather. Real engineers solve problems before they ask who gets the credit. Ethan smiled gently as his fingers brushed the edge of the paper. "You were right," he said softly. The sound of footsteps approached from the kitchen door connecting the garage to the house. His mother, Angela Brooks, stepped inside carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She had worked nearly 25 years maintaining buses for the Detroit Department of Transportation, and the smell of machine oil had long ago become as familiar to her as fresh bread. She handed one mug to Ethan without asking any questions. "Long day?" she asked. Ethan accepted the cup with a quiet smile. "Longer than expected." Angela studied her son's face for a moment before speaking again. "Did they listen?" Ethan looked toward the suspension prototype resting on the workbench. No. She nodded slowly, almost as if she had already known the answer before asking. Then what are you going to do tomorrow? Ethan picked up a mechanical pencil and opened a fresh engineering notebook. Keep working. Angela smiled with quiet pride. That sounds like your grandfather. Ethan looked at the unfinished suspension assembly sitting beneath the workshop lights. If the design is wrong today, it will still be wrong tomorrow. Someone has to fix it. Angela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You always believed machines could protect people. Ethan nodded. Because they should. Outside, rain finally began falling across the neighborhood rooftops, each drop tapping softly against the garage windows. The quiet rhythm filled the workshop while Ethan adjusted another three-dimensional model on his computer. He changed the reinforcement geometry, recalculated the load path, and watched the stress indicators slowly disappear from the screen. Green replaced red, stable replaced unstable, safe replaced uncertain. Across town, Richard Coleman sat inside his dark office holding Ethan's engineering reports once again. This time he read every page from beginning to end. With each calculation, every overlooked annotation, and every carefully documented recommendation, the weight of his earlier decisions became impossible to ignore. For the first time in many years, titles, experience, and reputation no longer mattered inside his office. Only the truth remained, printed in black ink across dozens of pages that should have been read long before the demonstration ever began. The next morning began without headlines or television cameras. Thick clouds drifted above downtown Detroit while the research center operated under an uncomfortable silence that no one could ignore. Every engineer arriving for work walked past the suspended prototype sitting motionless inside the testing hangar. Yellow inspection tape surrounded the vehicle, and dozens of sensors still clung to its frame like unanswered questions. Inside the executive conference room, Richard Coleman placed Ethan Brooks's engineering reports in the center of the polished table before anyone else arrived. This time, he did not stack financial projections on top of them. One by one, the board members entered quietly. James Walker carried his tablet but never opened it. Sarah Whitmore arrived with a folder containing the failed test data. No one spoke about schedules or investor presentations. Richard finally broke the silence. We are not discussing production today. We are discussing what we ignored. James slowly nodded. Agreed. Sarah connected her laptop to the conference display and projected two images across the screen. The first showed Ethan's simulation dated 3 days before the demonstration. The second displayed yesterday's telemetry results. Every curve matched almost perfectly. James leaned forward. That level of accuracy is extraordinary. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened unexpectedly. Daniel Foster, one of the largest private investors in the rescue vehicle program, entered carrying a small storage box that looked several years old. He placed it gently on the table. I heard about yesterday, he said quietly. Richard looked up. We are reviewing the engineering reports. Daniel nodded. Then you need to see something else first. He opened the box and carefully removed an old handheld electronic device with several insulated cables attached to one side. The casing showed years of use, but every label remained perfectly organized. Sarah studied it with curiosity. What is it? Daniel smiled faintly. The reason my son is alive. The room fell completely still. Richard frowned. I do not understand. Daniel sat down slowly before continuing. 2 years ago, my son Ryan was trapped inside our sport utility vehicle after an accident on Interstate 94 outside Ann Arbor. The electronic doors failed completely. Before emergency crews arrived, a young engineer carrying this homemade diagnostic tool restored the locking system in less than 2 minutes. James looked toward the device. Who built it? Daniel answered without hesitation. Ethan Brooks. Richard stared at him. Are you certain? Daniel reached back into the storage box and removed a folded thank you note written in his son's handwriting. Ryan spent months trying to identify the young man who helped him that evening. The state police could not locate him because he left before anyone asked his name. He unfolded another document. Last night, after hearing Ethan's name during the engineering review, Ryan remembered something. Daniel slid a printed photograph across the table. It showed a young Ethan standing beside his old silver pickup truck while packing away the same homemade diagnostic device after the highway incident. One of the highway traffic cameras captured this image. Sarah slowly picked up the photograph. It is him. Daniel nodded. Ryan recognized his face immediately. Richard remained speechless. Daniel continued, My son never forgot what that young man told him before opening the door. James looked up. What did he say? Daniel smiled softly. He said, "Stay calm. Machines can fail. People do not have to." The sentence lingered inside the room long after Daniel finished speaking. Sarah looked down at Ethan's engineering reports resting beside the photograph. He has always been building systems to protect people. Daniel gently placed the homemade diagnostic device beside the reports. Exactly. Richard slowly reached for the small invention, turning it carefully in his hands. Every wire had been labeled. Every connector had been reinforced. Every component reflected patience rather than shortcuts. He built this alone? Richard asked quietly. Inside a small garage workshop, Daniel replied. Long before any of us invested a single dollar into this rescue vehicle, no one spoke for several long moments. The polished conference table now held two powerful reminders side by side. One represented the future everyone wanted to build, the other represented the engineer they had chosen to ignore. Richard finally lowered his eyes. "We dismissed the only person who actually understood the problem," Sarah answered gently. Not only that, she placed Ethan's simulation directly beside the homemade diagnostic device. "We dismissed the man who had already proven that his first instinct is always to save lives." Richard leaned back slowly, his confidence replaced by something unfamiliar. Regret settled quietly across the room as every board member realized that the greatest mistake had never been the failed prototype waiting silently inside the hangar. Their greatest mistake had been believing that experience and status mattered more than character, evidence, and the quiet voice of the young engineer who had never stopped trying to protect people he had never even met. Richard Coleman had spent decades walking into corporate offices where every door opened before he reached it. But the small brick house on Maple Street in Detroit did not recognize titles or reputation. Late that afternoon, his black sedan rolled slowly to the curb in front of the modest home where Ethan Brooks had grown up. The neighborhood was quiet. Children rode bicycles beneath tall maple trees, while an elderly couple watered flowers across the street. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested million-dollar research programs or national engineering projects. Richard stepped out of the car carrying Ethan's worn engineering reports beneath one arm. James Walker and Sarah Whitmore followed a few steps behind without saying a word. They had insisted on coming, believing that some conversations deserved witnesses rather than private apologies. As Richard approached the front porch, the sound of metal tools tapping against steel drifted from the detached garage behind the house. Angela Brooks answered the front door before he could knock twice. She recognized the visitors immediately from the demonstration broadcast the previous day. Her expression remained calm. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. Richard removed his glasses and spoke more quietly than anyone in the boardroom had ever heard. "We are here to see Ethan." Angela studied his face for a long moment before nodding toward the garage. "He is working." Richard thanked her softly and walked across the driveway. The garage door stood open, revealing shelves lined with carefully organized tools, hydraulic components, notebooks, and mechanical prototypes. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long golden lines across the concrete floor. Ethan stood at his workbench wearing safety glasses while adjusting a redesigned suspension assembly mounted inside a steel test frame. He heard footsteps behind him but continued tightening a torque wrench until the measurement reached its exact specification. Only then did he remove the wrench and turn around. Surprise crossed his face for only a second before his usual calm expression returned. "Good afternoon," Ethan said. Richard looked around the workshop with quiet amazement. Every prototype carried handwritten notes. Every measurement was recorded. Every shelf reflected patience instead of luxury. Sarah noticed a wall covered with photographs of rescue vehicles, ambulances, and emergency crews from across the United States. James quietly examined a whiteboard filled with equations nearly identical to those Ethan had presented during the board meeting. Richard finally spoke. "I should have come here before making any decisions." Ethan smiled politely. "You are here now." Richard held out the engineering reports. "I read every page." Ethan accepted the folder without opening it. "Thank you." Richard took a slow breath. "Everything you predicted happened exactly the way you said it would." Ethan nodded once. "I know." There was no pride in his voice, only quiet certainty. Richard lowered his eyes. "I dismissed your work because I believed experience mattered more than evidence." Ethan answered gently, "Experience matters. It just should not replace listening." Silence settled over the workshop. Outside, a cool breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the open garage door. Sarah stepped forward holding the photograph Daniel Foster had shared that morning. "Ryan asked us to give you this." Ethan looked at the picture and immediately recognized the highway from 2 years earlier. He smiled faintly. He is doing well? Very well, Sarah replied. He starts college next spring. Ethan's smile grew slightly warmer. That is good news. James looked around the workshop once more before asking, "Why did you leave before anyone thanked you that night?" Ethan rested one hand on the redesigned suspension assembly. "Because someone else needed help more than I needed recognition." No one answered. Richard felt the weight of those words more deeply than any engineering report he had ever read. After another quiet moment, he reached into his jacket and removed an official project identification badge bearing Ethan's name. "The position is yours if you still want it," Richard said. "Not as an intern, not as an observer, as lead mechanical systems engineer." Ethan looked at the badge but made no move to take it. "Why?" Richard answered honestly. "Because I finally understand that the project never needed my pride. It needed your mind." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before looking toward the suspension prototype beside him. "If I come back," he said calmly, "nothing changes unless every engineer is allowed to question every design, regardless of age, title, or background." Richard nodded immediately. "Agreed." Sarah smiled for the first time that day. James extended his hand toward Ethan. "Then let us build the rescue vehicle the right way." Ethan looked at each of them before finally accepting the identification badge. "I will return," he said quietly, "not because you asked, but because the people waiting for that vehicle deserve our very best work." Richard offered his hand. Ethan shook it firmly. In that simple moment, no applause filled the garage, no cameras recorded the scene, and no headlines announced what had happened. Yet inside the small workshop, where ideas had always mattered more than appearances, respect quietly replaced assumption, and the future of the rescue vehicle finally began with the one thing it had been missing from the very beginning: the willingness to listen. 1 year later, the same research campus looked completely different. The morning sunlight poured through the glass walls of the Michigan Mobility Research Center, illuminating a production floor filled with engineers working side by side instead of behind invisible walls of status. New ideas covered whiteboards from corner to corner, and every design review now began with the same simple rule posted above the conference room entrance. Evidence speaks before titles. It had been Ethan Brooks's only condition for returning, and over time it had quietly transformed the culture of the entire organization. The rescue vehicle stood once again at the center of the testing facility, but it was no longer the same machine that had stopped halfway through the demonstration a year earlier. Every suspension component had been redesigned. Every stress point had been reinforced. Every calculation had been independently reviewed by engineers from every level of the organization, from interns to senior specialists. No report remained unread. No concern was dismissed because of the name printed on an identification badge. Richard Coleman stood near the observation window, watching dozens of engineers complete their final inspection. His hair had become noticeably grayer during the past year, yet something else had changed even more. He no longer entered meetings with all the answers. Instead, he asked questions before making decisions. Sarah Whitmore approached carrying a digital tablet filled with the latest certification results. "Federal approval came through this morning," she said with a smile. Richard nodded quietly. "Every requirement? Every single one." James Walker joined them moments later. "The first production vehicles are already scheduled for emergency response departments across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois." Richard looked through the glass toward Ethan, who was kneeling beside the prototype with Tyler Reynolds and 3 younger engineers. Instead of giving instructions, Ethan listened while one of the newest engineers explained a small adjustment to a sensor bracket. Ethan smiled and replied, "Show me your calculations." The young engineer opened a tablet with visible confidence. After reviewing the numbers, Ethan nodded. "That is a better solution. Let us use yours." Tyler smiled quietly. 1 year earlier, no junior engineer would have expected those words inside the building. Today, they had become ordinary. Moments later, the final demonstration began. The rescue vehicle accelerated smoothly across the same test track where it had once stopped under the weight of overlooked mistakes. This time, the emergency maneuvers unfolded exactly as Ethan's redesigned simulations had predicted. The vehicle changed direction with remarkable stability, crossed uneven terrain, climbed steep inclines, and completed every rescue sequence without a single warning indicator appearing on the engineering displays. Inside the observation gallery, applause rose naturally, but Ethan never turned toward the sound. His attention remained fixed on the live telemetry, quietly confirming every measurement before allowing himself the smallest smile. "Stable load distribution," Tyler announced. "All suspension values remain inside predicted limits." Sarah looked at Richard. This is what listening looks like. Richard nodded without taking his eyes off the track. Yes, he answered softly. It is. Later that afternoon, the completed rescue vehicle was presented to emergency responders from across the region. A simple plaque had been mounted near the entrance of the engineering wing. It did not celebrate profits or patents. Instead, it carried a single sentence chosen unanimously by the entire staff. Integrity protects lives before innovation ever can. Beneath those words appeared the names of every engineer who had contributed to the final design. Ethan Brooks's name stood among them, not larger than anyone else's, but impossible to overlook. As the ceremony concluded, Ryan Foster walked across the floor with his father, Daniel. Now, taller and preparing to begin college, Ryan stopped in front of Ethan with a warm smile. "I finally get to thank you properly," he said. Ethan smiled back. "You already did." Ryan shook his head. "No. You gave me another chance to live my life. That deserves more than thank you." Ethan placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then make that life count." Ryan nodded with quiet determination. Nearby, Richard watched the conversation in silence before slowly stepping outside the building. A light autumn breeze moved through the maple trees surrounding the campus, carrying golden leaves across the walkway where Ethan had once left alone with nothing but a worn leather folder and the certainty that truth would eventually reveal itself. Richard looked through the glass one final time and saw Ethan laughing with a team that now respected ideas more than appearances. No speeches could erase the mistakes of the past, but every decision made afterward could honor the lessons they had learned. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the finished rescue vehicle as it stood ready for its first real mission. And in that quiet moment, no one remembered the young engineer as the person who had once been dismissed. They remembered him as the man who never stopped trying to protect lives, even when no one was willing to listen.